One of the things I sometimes hear from atheists is the claim that there is absolutely no evidence that God exists. In fact, if I had £1 for every time that one of the atheists who hangs out on the SOLAS Facebook page, drawn to it like moths to a flame, if I had £1 for every time some atheist posted into a discussion thread at random, there is no evidence that God exists, I could probably retire or at least make short answers videos on a beach somewhere. So is it true that there is no evidence that God exists? Well, quite frankly, that's an absolutely ludicrous thing to say. It's one thing to say, I've looked at the evidence for God and I'm not convinced. I have atheist friends who would say that, who would say they have thought hard about the God question but are not convinced by the evidence. That's one thing. But to say that there's no evidence usually tells me the person hasn't even bothered thinking about the position at all, because quite simply there is vast amounts of evidence that God exists that if you're going to be a serious-minded atheist you would at least want to take a look at before being dismissive. For example, there is evidence for God from philosophy. There are very old and very serious arguments from philosophy for the existence of God. For example, there's something called the argument from contingency that says that everything we see in front of us has an explanation for its existence. This chair that I'm sitting in was brought into existence by people working in a factory. The factory itself was brought into existence by a series of events. The people who worked in the factory were made by their mum and dad, and the mum and dad were made by the previous generation, and so on and so forth. For everything we see around us, there's an explanation for it, and behind that another explanation. But, say philosophers, we need to ultimately arrive at something for which no explanation is required. Otherwise, we have a huge problem. Otherwise, we're stuck with what's called an infinite regress. And there's a very powerful argument that says that God looks like that ultimate it that stands behind everything else, the one who actually needs no explanation, whose very nature is simply to exist. Now, there's a heavy piece of philosophy, and maybe philosophy is not your thing, so there are arguments for God from science. For example, there's the fine-tuning argument in cosmology, taken very seriously by physicists and cosmologists. The argument from fine-tuning, actually, was first discovered by non-Christian physicists who noticed that wherever they looked in the physical sciences, some of the numbers programmed into the laws of physics are very precisely tuned. For example, the law of gravitation, the gravitational constant in physics. If that number was not absolutely precisely correct, there would be no matter, no universe, no planet Earth, no human beings, and so on. Nothing at all could exist. And physics is full of these so-called coincidences. And there are so many of them that Sir Fred Hoyle, very famous atheist physicist, in fact the gentleman who came up with the term Big Bang in the 20th century, Fred, a committed atheist, said that, the more I look at the laws of physics and the more I see these numbers programmed into them, the more it looks like a super intellect has monkeyed with the laws of physics and chemistry and biology. And there are simply no blind forces worth speaking about in the sciences. And so there are powerful arguments that would say that God is a very good explanation of the way the laws of science, laws of physics, are so powerfully and beautifully put together. So there are evidence for God from philosophy, evidence from the sciences. Then we get into what I might say are more existential arguments for the existence of God that really look at human nature and experience and build from there. For example, why is it as human beings that we are drawn to things like beauty and meaning and purpose and significance? Other animals in biology are quite happy to simply reproduce and survive. But as human beings, we're concerned with much deeper questions. What is it that's created us that way? Are we simply a freak of evolution, thrown up in a way with these desires within us that can't match onto anything in reality? Or is it that actually, as the Bible says, we are made in the image of God? Or consider something like human rights. That is so much part of our discourse today. Where does human value and dignity actually come from if we are just atoms and particles? And so there are powerful arguments there. And then finally, on top of arguments from philosophy, from science, existential arguments, arguments from rights and morality, lastly, there are arguments from history. And I think one of the most powerful arguments for the existence of God is the arguments from the life, death and resurrection of Jesus of Nazareth, particularly arguments for the resurrection. They're a powerful historical argument you can mount for the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, I did a debate at St Andrews University in Scotland a couple of months ago with an atheist skeptic on the very subject of did Jesus rise from the dead? And we were so encouraged that the many atheists who had come that evening were actually, in the words of one of them, profoundly shaken by how powerful the historical evidence was for the resurrection of Jesus. Now, I've just skirted over those arguments at high speed. You can take a look at other short answers videos on the Solas website where we go into each of those arguments in more detail. And also, if what I've said has whetted your appetite, I encourage you to check out the Beginner's Guide to Apologetics series that we're running on the Solas website in the first few months of 2020, when we're going to take a detailed look at all of those arguments. Because together, I think they mount a compelling case that God does exist. Not one piece of evidence, but a multi-threaded, multi-stranded argument for the existence of God that has led many people who've taken it seriously and investigated the evidence and pursued it where it leads to come to the conclusion that not merely does God exist, but that God has stepped into history in the person of Jesus Christ and has shown not just who he is, but what he thinks of us and what he's done for us.